as I'm talking to you, I'm not wearing any of my pieces. I'm gonna quickly make something and put it on.
You're, I mean, that in itself is like part of the presentation. To be able to sit there and quickly make something, that in itself is impressive.
Ugh.
Yeah, I think that maybe that will be the intro to this whole thing. It's like, oh, I'm not wearing anything, so I'm gonna make something quickly while we're at it. That's beautiful. That's like, that shows creativity at its best.
Are you recording? Oh, good.
Yeah,
It's recording. Great.
I'm what I did. Look, I've screwed up so many times, um, and I've given because it's actually running through like a third party does all of our outside work. And then it comes, they use Google Teams. I'm sorry, they use Google Meet. And Google Meets
Okay.
and Microsoft don't get along. There you go.
Yeah.
You see, you built something like that.
Yeah.
Um, so they don't get along. And then we have another application called Apollo, which is like similar to a CRM. And that's what
Okay.
handles all of our meetings. And that's kind of what ties it all together. And I've had a couple meetings like yours. And then I had one last week, an absolutely incredible one with a really, really brilliant gentleman from the UK. It just didn't record. And he got like really upset. The fact that he was in a cab doing it and it was really choppy didn't seem to bother him at all. The fact that I couldn't record it pissed him off. So go figure. But now I've taken precautions and I do the invite through Teams. I record and I actually push the record button just in case. So hopefully I'm well protected.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I guess what and I think you know the drill already. But I want to thank you again, and I think more importantly, I want to thank you for the patience of coming back not just once, but to do this. This is wonderful, and I'm so grateful for that. So thank you, and I guess welcome back is the right term for it. So uh, I think you know the drill, but we're going to start at the very beginning again for those that don't know us so intimately at this point. Uh, I still, and I'm still having an issue, and it may be the humble side of me. The term Mavericks is, and I think that the way I equate it, if I will read someone's LinkedIn profile and I will see that they call themselves Mavericks, they call themselves innovators, they seem to throw flowers on themselves. I'm always concerned about that. So I'm curious about one, what you think of the term Maverick, and two, if you think that you are one, why?
Mm. Well, Maverick to me means you're a trailblazer. You're doing something differently than the rest that makes you stand out. And I would like to think I'm a maverick in terms of what I'm doing. I also perceive myself as humble in the term, in the, I guess, the idea that I'm putting a lot of work into what I'm doing. But that being said, the way I'm approaching what I'm doing in terms of manufacturing, I would like to think is different than what I've seen before. Uh, when I've worked in the industry. So I've worked in the fashion industry and digital marketing industry. That was my background before starting my company, MLE. And not only just in terms of processes of manufacturing to be more sustainable for the environment and being conscious about the products we're making, but then also how I treat my team and making sure that the team that I work with, that also is a sustainable relationship, that they're paid a fair wage, that everyone's treated fairly, that they have flexibility to do other things besides work with me. So I would perceive that to be a different approach than what I've seen. And for that reason, yes, I would like to be a Maverick, please.
There you go. Okay. And you wear the badge with honor. I'll go with that. So
Okay.
I'm going to go back to your childhood days again. And I love hearing the stories about how what people perceive themselves to be in their youth and the journey that they've taken to get to where you are at the moment.
Sure. So I've always been creative. As a child, I was very into the visual arts, working with clay, painting a lot. And as I got older, and started to think about what I could do as a career, I was actually very interested in becoming a graphic designer. That being said, my parents are, I'm first generation American. My mom's Armenian by way of Iran. My dad's Italian, and their background is they both have PhDs in chemistry and worked in the hard sciences. And my dad is also a physician. So having that, as my parents, and then also being first generation American, the idea of being, for me, doing something creative was worrisome for them. And they really advised me to focus on something, more concrete, something like a lawyer or working in finance or getting a full-time job that would be reliable, or even working in, the hard sciences. So I was actually interested when I was in high school. I didn't say this last time we chatted, but I was actually interested in becoming a plastic surgeon. And the reason I landed on that, I was like, well, this is a creative thing, and I'm good with my hands, and I think I could be good at this. But then I ended up going to Johns Hopkins University for undergrad, and after first semester chemistry, it just wasn't it wasn't I wasn't absorbing it. Just it was, didn't quite make sense to me. And I gave a hard thought about it, and I decided, I really do love the visual arts. Johns Hopkins didn't have a visual arts program, so the closest thing at that point was history of art. So I studied art history at Johns Hopkins, which actually has a great program. And as I was approaching graduation, at that point, that was 2009, we were in a recession. And I thought a lot about, what does that mean in terms of graduating with a degree in art history? Do I want to pursue graduate school? Like, what does this turn into? And I was still very interested in the visual arts myself. I was doing paintings on the side, and I thought about how to turn my paintings into something commercial. I started actually hand painting on t-shirts, then thinking about just, that process of making them. How could I speed this up? I taught myself how to silk screen, and I started actually burning screens and printing t-shirts in my dorm with my roommate. And what ended up happening was, every time I would silk screen a bunch of t-shirts, I would sell out on campus, which was really cool and exciting. And that first summer after graduating, that's how I supported myself. I did markets in Baltimore, and I sold my t-shirts, and that was really an amazing time for me to be creative. I connected with a lot of people and musicians in the art scene. I started dressing performers that would wear my t-shirts when they were doing their gigs, and that was just like a whole other world for me. Very exciting. And then that turned into, fall came. It was getting cold. People weren't wearing t-shirts as much, and I was thinking about, what can I do to apply this to something that would appeal to people as the weather got colder. Vintage and thrifting was a big scene at that time in Baltimore, especially in the arts community. So I started buying vintage clothing, silk screening on that. Then that turned into altering the vintage clothing to, upcycle it and turn into something else, which then turned into me wanting to make my own patterns, copying shapes that I saw in vintage clothing, making my own patterns, buying fabric. I started going to the garment district in New York, traveling, taking the bus to buy fabric back to Baltimore. And in the midst of all this, my parents were kind of suspicious of what was going on, a little bit like, how can this turn into a career? What happened? You went to like such a good school. And so they actually advised me to apply to grad school and get an MBA, in the hopes that the business learnings, I'd be able to apply that to my business. And It intrigued me. So I applied. I was accepted to NYU Stern for a part-time MBA program. I moved to New York and I did the part-time program. It was a 3-year program, and I also ran my business on the side. And it was very interesting to me because at that point, I was 22, 23, getting my MBA, running this company, and then all my classmates were about 10 years older than me. Most of them worked in finance, and they were getting their MBA because they were actually hoping one day to have their own company and be their own bosses. So in a way, the scripts were flipped, and I didn't have any business experience. The business experience I was getting, I was really from what I was doing at the time with my own company. That being said, I was exposed to digital marketing for the first time. I started taking classes in that, and that opened up a whole other world to me, which was really exciting. And also around this time, I got my first wholesale order from Urban Outfitters. The first order was, I actually have it here, the check framed, but it was a $12,000 order for clothing that I had designed. And it was the largest sum of money I'd ever seen in my entire life. And it was very exciting. And I had to figure out, how do I do this production run for this order for Urban Outfitters? And something about I don't know if anyone already knows this in terms of who's listening to the podcast, but when you get an order like this, the way it works is they place an order usually about 6 months before the order needs to ship, and then you get paid on net terms. So at that time it was net 60, which meant 60 days after the order shipped, that's when I would get paid. So I had to figure out, how do I fund this order to do the production. I was getting, custom fabric made overseas, shipped to me. I had to find a factory to cut and sew everything. So that was all. I had to pay that myself in the hopes that, after I ship, I would get paid 60 days after. So I ended up actually having another job. I got a full-time job as a print designer for a women's company. I was designing prints for their clothing to be able to fund this order for Urban Outfitters. So in a way, that was, overwhelming, between the full-time job, managing these wholesale orders, and then getting my MBA. It was a lot. It was a lot. And then a turning point for me was, I remember when we were doing the production runs for Urban Outfitters, going to the factory, seeing the fabric being laid, seeing them cutting all the pieces for the clothing, and then what was left on the table were all the scraps, which I had never seen or thought about this before, because I never had been exposed to this kind of volume, firsthand. And I asked the factory owner, as they were working, the employees were working, I said, like, what happens to all this extra material? What do you do with it? And his answer was, it just gets thrown out. At that point, sustainability in fashion wasn't a thing. And I thought a lot about that, in terms of the waste being generated. And I didn't have an answer for it at the time, but I didn't like that. I didn't like that. I didn't like the net terms. And it just became just turned into, what, this is not sustainable for me, between having this job to be able to fund this. I don't like the waste being generated. Clothing is very complicated because you have to worry about fit, you have to worry about different sizes. So I decided to just take a pause on it. Once I graduated with my MBA, I worked in digital marketing and e-commerce for a few different agencies in the city. I worked as a head of e-commerce for a fashion brand in the city. And what I enjoyed about that is the ideas I had, that, I had inklings of this when I had started my first company. I was applying to these multi-million-dollar companies, advising them, and it was working. And so that gave me a lot of confidence to say, okay, the ideas I have are working. I just don't have that kind of scale yet. So after about, I'd say, 10 years of this, working digital marketing, e-commerce, getting that experience, I decided to try having my own company again. But this time I wanted to do women's accessories. And there were a few reasons for that. Accessories, you don't have to worry so much about seasons, and there's less of a need to push out collections, a certain number of collections every year. You can be seasonless. I also like the idea of made to order. I like the idea of things being sizeless, not having to worry so much about fit. And so I started again. I launched a brand called MLE. My name is Emily, and it's the letters MLE, so it's an eponymous label. I launched that late 2018. And what was interesting about it this time was all the experience I had had working digital marketing, e-commerce, I was able to apply to my business. So one thing I had learned a lot at the previous position I just worked at as head of e-commerce for that women's fashion brand is I was running their Instagram and Facebook ads. And so I learned a lot about, technically how to do that, and I was able to apply that to my business. So instantly I was getting sales. And I had one piece that actually went viral. I'm wearing it right now. It's called the Gentlewoman's Agreement, and it has this magnetic hand-shaped clasp. So it opens like that, and then you close it. And this was a piece that went viral. It's also at a time I was launching, the Me Too movement. Women's rights were a huge focus. So that helped a lot. And this became my top selling piece, I'd say within the first month of me launching my business. And for about the first 3 years of my business, this was the majority of our sales, which was really cool. I mean, like, in a way, it feels like it was an accident, but I'd like to think it's not an accident.
Yeah, serendipity is really sometimes it's there for a reason.
Yeah. So, and then, I've had my brand now, it's been 6 years. Things have changed a bit. So this piece actually ended up getting knocked off. We found over 200 different sellers on Amazon and Etsy and eBay selling knockoffs of this version. And you can see, if you look at my data, like when the knockoff started coming out, the correlation of sales dropping. And this happens a lot. It happens to anyone that has a popular product. It forces you to innovate. It forces you to think about other different things to come out with. I have other categories now, which has been really exciting. I have hair accessories. Hair clips have been a huge category for me, and I'm also focusing a lot on handbags and leather goods. So it's been exciting because that helped me launch my business and grow my business. And so that brings us to where we are now. I'm located in upstate New York in Saugerties. I've been here now for about 4 years. We moved right before the pandemic. I am sitting in my studio right now. And this is where we manufacture the majority of our pieces. So my jewelry, my handbags, it's all being made here. We have leather goods. I don't know if you can see my leather machine over there. So I have a small team that we come in a few times a week and we make everything here. And then other than that, my hair clips, I design them all myself and they're made overseas in China. And that's because in terms of the equipment needed to produce these pieces, it's very technical. And because of that, the only place I've been able to find is a factory in China, and they do a very wonderful job in terms of the quality. I'm very happy with them. And that brings us to where we are today.
Well, it's I think you were going on cruise control there. You didn't really need to ask any questions. You took it from beginning to end. Well done.
Oh,
Extremely well done. Like I said, to have me say nothing for a while is rare. So
oh,
that's well done.
thank you.
So I think, because we talk about innovation and you sort of you talked about the innovation of how you move. Where I'm always curious about is the process, the manufacturing process, and I think that you have two different criteria. One of them being domestic and how you do things domestically, and two, how you do things offshore, because I think I shared a document with you that I'm all about process and I'm
Mhm.
all about understanding how it's done. So I think that process to me is really important. So can you just explain a little bit about the actual manufacturing process from conception up until it's out your door?
Sure. So conception usually starts with a sketch that I'll draw myself with pencil and paper. And then after that, we have to figure out how to make it. So if it's fabric based, I took a pattern making course actually when I was living in the city at FIT. So we do pattern making. We'll draw it out, we'll check that, and that'll turn into a sample. If it's something like a piece of jewelry or hardware, that will either be carved in wax or we'll develop it in CAD. I've actually taken the time to start learning CAD myself because of the cost involved with having to hire someone to do CAD. And also, a lot of times, your vision, when you're relying on someone else to translate it, it's almost like drawing or painting. The subtleties of what can come out in CADs. I sometimes I feel like it's easier if I just do it. So that could be things like we have like this, for example, this clasp was developed in CAD. I have a matching set of earrings that have hands like this. That started with a sketch turned into CAD. I have a matching ring that's a handshake that was CAD. Um, and so the CAD file, what happens with that is you send it to the casting company and they usually 3D print it and then they make a mold. And the cool thing about jewelry is now there are 3D printers that actually print in a wax that you can just directly go to casting, which has saved a lot of time and
Hmm.
expenses. And then other than that, in terms of flat goods, for my leather development, we've actually been using a Cricut. Do you know what that is? It's
No.
almost like a printer, but instead of ink, it has a blade. So you can come up with shapes on your computer that usually what I do is I like using Illustrator. It's an Adobe program to come up
Hmm.
with a shape, and then I put it into Cricut, and it cuts. You can cut very intricate shapes. You can even feed fabric into this. I fed leather into that, and that's how we do a lot of our samples. And then once that sample is approved, then we will order like dyes and stamps from factories once we know, okay, we like this, we want to do more volume with that. So I think that's it in terms of other technology. I'm trying to think what else we're using. Did I miss anything? Did you feel like there's anything else you wanted me to?
I'm fascinated. I think that, sometimes people, they innately know what they do, and you described it extremely well. It's basically what you're doing is, and you're taking it through the casting, and then obviously there's the production end, which is usually the easier part of the game. It's,
Hmm.
once you get the proto, once you've already approved your proto, there's basically, when you're getting, depending on if you're mass producing or single unit producing, there's always that variance of, from prototype through to pre-production and bulk approval. I'm sure that you've seen that coming through on occasion, but you've done a great job in explaining that. I usually, and I try to be restrictive of time only because I'm seeing that half an hour is usually analytics
Hmm.
where they've had enough of us. Um, so I have two things. One of them is I like to share on LinkedIn a brief 30-minute to 1 minute introduction that basically highlights yourself, your company, and attracts people. They look at this and they go, wow, I really want to hear a little bit more about Emily. So we do that. So there are two options for this. One of them, if you're able to, off the cuff, be able to come up with that 30-second to 1 minute blurb that we can publish. And I will send you a copy of it prior to publishing so that you can approve it. Or we can arrange either a pre-scripted one or some more formal one, whichever you prefer. So that becomes the next little piece of this that I'd love to do, if you are open to doing that now, or if you'd like to do that at a later time.
Okay, great. We can do that now.
Okay, cool. So take it away.
Okay. MLE is a sustainably made women's accessories brand manufactured in upstate New York. We design statement pieces for the modern gentlewoman and make the majority of our accessories in our studio in Saugerties. You can find us at madebymle.com, on Instagram at madebymle, or visit our store in Saugerties, New York.
There you go. And you were prepared for that one. And I can see that you were prepared for it. I have one last question. Well, I have two, but one of them is not part of the podcast. Um, the the last question that I always like to ask is, if you were to walk into, I'll call it a bar, because not everybody goes to bars, but if you were to go sit down at a bar and order yourself a drink, and some young woman or man came up to you and looked at you and said, I'm a little lost. I'm not sure what I should do, what path I should take. I'm just unsure of where I'm supposed to go in life. What advice would you share with them?
not sure what their path is?
Yeah, basically they're a little
Okay.
confused about where they are, what they should do with their life. I mean, you went through a circuitous life. You had your
Yeah.
parents that wanted something, and it would be interesting to know what do they think now. But what advice would you give to someone who's just coming up in their career and they're not sure really of what to do, how they should do it, if they should do it? What would you
Yeah.
tell them?
Well, first in terms of picking out, something to move towards, and this is the empath in me, but I would say move towards what brings you joy. It's so important to find joy in what you're doing, especially when it's work, something that, you're going to be spending the majority of your life or your time doing. What excites you? What gets you in a state of, I call it flow, where you lose track of time and you're just able to, just become one with whatever you're doing. So once you identify that, you know, it's also making sure, are you good at it? Can you be good at it? Can you put in the time, in terms of like, and then, sometimes it's a big goal in terms of what you're trying to achieve. How can you break it down into bite-sized steps? I remember when I decided I wanted to launch my new company, I felt so overwhelmed by this whole thing, and I decided, I'm just gonna take this in steps. The first thing is I'm just going to make a logo. Let's just get the logo done. And then once I had the logo, I was like, "Okay, this feels more official. What's the next step?" And just move that. And then you'll see after a series of time, it's almost like erosion. It just kind of adds up, to a point where you do all these little steps and then you take a step back and you're like, wow, I got to this point. And it feels like at that point, I think it's also important to be proud of like how far you've come and to put that in perspective. I think a lot of time you're so in it and just trying to move along, you forget about where you originally came from.
It's interesting that you say it. I call it the proverbial "how do you eat an elephant?" And it's basically one bite at a time.
Mhm.
And you describe that really, really well. So I do want to thank you for your time. You, as I said, and I've said this before, you're an extremely articulate young woman. You really, really, I'm impressed with what you've accomplished, how you've accomplished, and how you express how well you have accomplished it. Because really, you've made it so easy for me. I mean, I just sit back and, like I said, this was cruise control. So this was wonderful.
Oh,
I
thank
thank
you.
you. No, my pleasure.